So when we talk about learning outcome in general, which is learning outcome 4, we're going to throw another variable into the mix today, which is going to be motivation. So when I talk about motivation, it's all okay sometimes to have employees, job responsibilities, the best leaders, the right, structure within the organization, which leads to the right culture, which is culture of, let's say competitiveness, cooperation, collaboration, which allows the organizations to achieve, objectives at the end of the day. So every individual will have their own targets or their own job sheet, and they would need to complete that or achieve those goals. And thereby, when we add all these goals together, it ends up adding and achieving the organizational goal, departmental goal first, then followed by, the organizational goal, which would have been set. Now, one of the key things that we look at when we throw the variable like motivation into the mix is that in spite of having the right structure, the best leaders, the best managers, and maybe the best employees with this right skills and experience from a point of view of working on projects, we do see sometimes, employees are not able to still achieve the objectives. And this could be because of very many reasons. One, there is people working within the organization who are not satisfied with their current role. They are not probably being recognized. There is no sense of achievement, or there are no emoluments or rewards which have been put in place which allow them to stretch or, obviously look at accomplishing that goal. So in general, lack of training, lack of motivation, when we talk about lack of incentives, reward mechanisms, sense of achievement, recognition, different words that we can put together. Sometimes you still see, in spite of having the best managers, the best team, the best infrastructure, and everything in terms of resources being available, still the organization does not meet its objective at the end of the year. And one of the key reasons that we look at that why this does not happen is because there is no motivation, there is no passion, there is no enthusiasm within the workers or staff, employees in a business, in an organization to be able to achieve the objectives, to go after the objectives, to achieve them. So when we talk about the role of motivation, it is quite important within the organization, because here managers who basically are responsible for, say, managing and supervising a number of employees as department heads or as regional managers or people working within the HR side, have a fundamental and primary responsibility to ensure that the work which is required to be done is achieved at the end of the day. And in order to make sure that the employee is motivated enough, is convinced, and is, let's say, I don't want to use the word motivating again, but is basically looking at the fact that they want to ensure that the environment created within the organization is conducive, which basically propels and pushes the employees to look at making, achievement on those goals. And in order to do so, the variable, which is motivation, comes into play. So sometimes you would see, generally speaking, without getting into any details, you would see that some employees who have been within an organization for a number of years get, a kick out of or get motivated by looking at recognition. Some of them get motivated by higher pay or, reward or incentives. And in some cases, you would see that some employees within the organization, if they've been working for a number of years and have been achievers, they basically get motivated by, or, their interest gets stimulated by, if we talk about additional responsibility, decision-making authority, or in general, the power to be able to take decisions on key, aspects of the organization or functions within the organization. So it could be need, recognition, pay, reward, power, lots of different other incentives, which could be clubbed under what are called emoluments or, employee stock option plans, incentive trips, whatever you call it. They would all classify as what are called motivators, which would motivate different types of employees in their career or in their, journey within the organization, business at a given particular stage. So people who join the company new might be more motivated by, looking at achieving a permanent status or getting confirmed in their job role, and then, obviously getting the usual perks and incentives which are prescribed in the job or the offer which they receive as a contract. A couple of years into the organization, they might be more interested in in looking at, getting more responsibility, maybe more pay. They might be looking at, more power in terms of decision-making authority. And that trend tends to continue when we dwell deeper into the organization. So motivation in general is a very, very important factor which HR and managers essentially concentrate on, because if you know what ticks the employee, if you know what basically would motivate your colleague or your peer essentially to achieve that task and job, then there is an incentive available with you to be able to get that done by putting that particular reward incentive in place to ensure that come what may, the targets would be achieved, the job would be done, and the employees would essentially be happier because they're achieving, they're being rewarded, they're achieving, they're being recognized, they're awarded, they're recognized, and obviously they are then also getting additional responsibilities within the organization. So motivation is what we're going to be looking at in today's learning outcome, and it talks about understand how organizations can motivate employees in order to improve efficiency and effectiveness. And there are, 4 assessment criteria that we're going to be looking at. The first one talking about what are the benefits and issues when we talk about, decision making, the process, and how motivation plays into that. The second one talks about what are the different ways through which we can motivate. And here is what we'll put on our creative hats to basically, come out with ideas of what we actually see happening within organizations when we talk about motivational, speeches. So sometimes some organizations, at the end of the year do annual conferences, or you're invited to annual conferences or, seminars, and you bring in a motivational speaker, which basically looks at, prepping up the employees, the staff of the organization by giving resounding examples of, how the organization, wants them to work, or the desire for the organization to be able to recognize their achievement and things like that. We'll also look at the key motivational theory frameworks, which is something that we need to be aware of. So when we talk about motivation, we'll understand where it all started, what kind of experiments were done, how this has evolved over the years and decades, and what are the very relevant models which have now come to be accepted by, in general, across the board when we talk about motivation and motivational techniques. And last but not the least, the distinction criteria is basically to look at, choosing a named organization. And when we look at a named organization, it has to be a named organization. That means you pick up a company like Jumbo Electronics in the Middle East, or you pick up Samsung, or any company that you have, insight into, or at least have, you want to look at doing a bit of research. So here, a named company would need to be chosen. And in that organization, you will need to look at maybe using a bit of research to try and see the HR handbook, which basically describes, what are the various schemes, incentive, reward mechanism, talent management, career professional development, training and development, which is used within organizations to keep employees motivated. And how do these organizations look at motivating employees? So here the idea would be to discuss some of the ideas that you have seen. It could be your own organization that you're at your place of work, and you could look at that as an exemplar to cover this particular task. Now, in order to discuss this particular learning outcome, what we've got is a few slides on the PowerPoint presentation. And what I would do is, when I look at the indicative content, there are key bits that we need to be able to cover, although it's quite scarce. But it basically all rotates around understanding motivation, motivational theories, and in general, how we apply these theories in the modern context when we talk about a organization or a business, or essentially, if we work as managers, we would be, looking at applying some of these essentially to, make use of these theories to essentially motivate our staff and employees, or our peers who we are responsible for, say for example functionally or administratively. Now, before we get into the assessment criteria, let's look at a bit of a chart to try and understand essentially in terms of what are the various theories, in terms of looking at the overall trend in terms of how they've evolved over the years. And in this case, what we will do is this particular mind map that you see on your slide basically, kind of summarizes the main theories which have come up over the years, wherein a lot of researchers, psychologists, scientists have done a lot of work. But what we want to be able to do is basically carve out a bit of a journey just to see where it all started. So if I look at very briefly, pointing out that we look at some of these motivational stories starting from Frederick Taylor's scientific experiment. Then we go on to Myos, Hawthorne effect, which was the second bit of, experiments that were done. Then we get into Mcgregor's theory, McClelland's theory. We look at the hygiene theory, or Herzberg's hygiene factor theory, theory X and, theory Y. And then we look at Maslow's theory in particular, which basically is quite widely accepted. We talk about the Maslow's pyramid of hierarchy, wherein he basically talks about the 5 different types of needs which individuals have, and we'll discuss that in a bit more detail. And there are a few others which have come up in terms of modern scope. Some of them were highly influenced, by Maslow. Some of them were influenced by Frederick Taylor, and some of them were influenced by, Myos' Hawthorne effect, which is the experiment that he did in the Western Electric Company. And this is where we will see the beginnings of, how motivation started to become an important point of discussion within organizations. So we start with basically the Frederick Taylor's scientific experiment somewhere in the 1900s, wherein he basically looked at a few bits and pieces and proposed an idea, and that was then pushed forward. And today we see, the Maslow's theory being accepted pretty much across the board, when we talk about in the 1950s when we introduced that. So this is a bit of a snapshot, but we look at a few slides just to briefly and discuss and, go through an overview of some of these theories for our understanding, so that we know exactly when we see a particular situation in an organization, or when we see a certain type of leadership style, culture, and structure, we can see what kind of theory could be applied, or, what kind of theory would be practically applicable in that context when we talk about motivation in the overall, context of the organization or the business. Now, before we get into that, one or two things that I would like to basically quickly cover would be, how do you define motivation? What is motivation? Motivation could have different meanings and connotations for every individual. What would be motivation for you in general? How do you think you are motivated? What are the various things that motivate you when we talk about work in general?
For example, your mentors are pushing you to go an extra mile and prove yourself. So they motivate you that there is a part of something that needs to be explored within. That's what I would consider as a motivation.
Okay.
Personally, what motivates me is... Sorry.
Go on.
I was just thinking, what you're talking about motivating you, is it in the sense of professional motivation or personal motivation?
No, in general motivation. It could be professional and personal, but in general, what is motivation to you?
It's something that would allow me to feel like I need to get something done. It's like a drive, I would say.
That is correct. So basically, when we look at both the bits that you've raised, yourself, between the both of you, motivation could be anything. Motivation could be personal, professional. That's the first, differentiation that you would do. At the personal level, you might be motivated, to accomplish certain things, which could be personal goals, like studying this particular course or achieving a particular objective. And this personal side of your goal might be related to your professional objective of, maybe having a completion on this course, leading to something like a degree, and then at some stage leading to a promotion or a better job, or an in turn a better career. So motivation can be personal, professional. Motivation, could be a desire to complete a task, complete this course. It could be something that you're looking at achieving, which is something as a greater whole allows you to, work towards it. It might not be something that you might be able to accomplish immediately, and it could be a long-term goal that you're looking at working on, and the motivation that you get, or the reason why you are basically following that would be that at the end of the day, when you are trying to achieve it, there is something that you would gain from it, and that would be, the expectation of the reward, which would be, driving you to, kind of go towards that goal. It could be to achieve targets. It could be to achieve, excellence in some cases. It could be to try and maintain a mark of quality. Or say, for example, if you're known in the organization to deliver on time, if you're known in the organization that you are a very good time management, very good at time management, you're very meticulous in planning, you might be looking at maintaining that as a particular a trait, and because of which people get to know you, or you get praise within the organization. That would itself be a reason for motivation, that I want to continue doing the same things and continue doing them at the right in the right fashion, in the correct manner, so that you continuously get rewarded. So that could be motivation. Sometimes you would see that you would need others to basically come in and encourage you, and that would be when either you need help in terms of physical resources, or you need help and support in terms of other resources which would be required for you to be able to complete your job. And in some cases, sometimes if you're coming up with a wall or an issue or a failure, and in those cases maybe the need for you to keep going would also be defined as motivation. So it's a word which broadly would have very many connotations. And generally speaking, when we talk about motivation in general, you would basically look at you could basically relate it to I would say anything on your personal and professional side, which gives you a reason for you to go out and achieve something, go out and do something, or go out or behave in a particular fashion, and that would be the reason, or that would be the main cause of or definition of motivation. Now, when we talk about the reason, one of the things that sometimes you'll have to step back and let's say think that why do we need to look at motivation at all? I'm given some bit of work at the office, or at the in my place of work, and because I'm working there, I'm employed, I need to be able to do that work. But why do you need motivation? So sometimes you would see that when we talk about the reason why people sometimes need to be driven, they need to be given some incentives, rewards, or in some cases they need to be made to feel that they are wanted, and the work that they do is desired, is highly desirable. Then in those cases you would see organizations, either to retain them or to get the best output from them, would look at falling back onto motivation. So this would be an emotional process in some cases, which the organization would use by using certain types of tools and techniques to keep the individual motivated and working within the organization. So there are lots of different types of talks that you can get to see and hear, especially on TED Talk, when we look at motivational talks and speeches, inspirational speeches by a lot of different renowned or popular CEOs. You would generally see that they make these speeches in order to ensure that everybody is on the same plane, everybody understands the objective of working within the organization, what the organization stands for, and what they do is, in between their speeches, in between the examples that they give, they try and dovetail the let's say the usages, or let's say the advantages of keeping staff motivated, because it encourages them to generally perform, and some of the speeches that they give, some of the techniques they use, some of the schemes they introduce are designed primarily to keep them engaged within the organization. So a simple example in this case would be, just slightly digressing, would be when you join the organization. In most organizations today, if you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, you'll basically send everything electronically, or at best you will receive something in the post. And that would be like an induction, and you'll get maybe 1 or 2 day training. But most of these trainings are to be done on a self study basis. There are company portals through which you will be asked to complete those trainings, and you get very little help in terms of having any interaction in most cases when you're completing these trainings. The main way to test that you've completed this training would be to ask you to take a test at the end of it, and there's a certain pass percentage which most organizations define, and that is to say that, okay, the individual has completed that training, and that gives you the sense of how the organization works, what are the basic things that you will need to maintain, and how would you need to conduct yourself. And in those cases, they would be necessary for you to go through. But at some stage, once you've gone through these trainings, you would see that somebody would then have a phone call with you, just generally try and have a chit chat to find out, did the trainings go okay? Were there any issues? Did you have any questions or queries related to the training? Was there anything that you did not understand? And that is where the human element comes in, or your managerial side of things starts to flow in, wherein managers then tend to pick that up and then do a bit of hand holding to say, okay, if these things were left behind or not well explained, let me help and cover that. And the idea of doing this is that they're trying to build a relationship, and in building that relationship, they are making sure that they are also getting to know the individual, but at the same time they are throwing in and observing various important things which would inform them about how the individual would essentially behave when they look at say for example giving them work, and in those circumstances, when would the work be complete, what kind of embodiments or requirements would the individual have, and they would then try and put those things and relate them to what are called motivational tools and techniques. And that is what we need to be able to study and understand, that as a manager we need to know very clearly how to use these tools and techniques, how to keep the individuals happy, motivated within the organization, so that when it comes to getting work done, you are a popular leader or a popular manager, you know how to manage your staff, and you know what makes them tick. And in some cases, when you have to use a carrot and stick approach, or you have to incentivize the work or prioritize the work to be done, you have to use some of these motivational tools and techniques to be able to get things done and get them organized and get them done on time. Now, where did it all start? So we'll go back into the 19th century when we talk about Frederick Taylor's experiment. Now he basically proposed, and his study is basically considered as the starting point for the study of motivation. Now he believed that there are various ways to get the job done, but in essence what he proposed was that the main reason, or prima facie the reason for people to work, is money. So if they are paid well, you would generally see people would be committed to completing the work, or will be more productive workers. And he came up with an experiment that he did, wherein he basically said that if we treat humans primarily from a point of view of economic resource, if you pay them well and you incentivize them, then you would be able to get more work you would be able to get more work out of them. So his experiment basically was based on the fact that if you differentiate, basically managers need to differentiate how the work is set within the organization. So they need to be able to set work at a level wherein the basic bit of work has to be set at a level wherein everybody tries to achieve that. And then when they try and create a stretch, or the increased amount of work, they should be willing to pay a little higher incentive or a little higher pay, which would help differentiate that if you work less, you barely get, you barely achieve, the bare minimum living wage. And if you stretch and if you do more and keep pace with what is being asked for in order for you to complete the work, then in those cases, the pay is going to be slightly higher. So his experiment was, generally accepted, but in most cases, this particular idea that people are only motivated by money, over the years, as the work over the decades essentially elaborated, new theories were proposed. This particular theory was, kind of sidelined. It was not something which was applicable across all sectors. Maybe manufacturing, production, engineering sectors, yes, but in other places, this got sidelined. Then we talk about, what is called the Myos Hawthorne experiment. Now, his work in the late, or the early 19th century in the late, mid 19th century, basically, he did a series of experiments, and he came up with what is called, let's say, he came to a conclusion after conducting these experiments that if you need to get productivity, or if you need to ensure that productivity is achieved within the organization, what you have to do is you have to, he proposed that you have to keep changing the environment, and adjustments to the environment have to be made in such a way that it allows individuals to work, the management and the workers to be able to collaborate and communicate effectively, and last but not the least, the managers need to be able to have a very clear plan in terms of how they would want the work to be done. So he focused on his findings on the basis of the investigation that he carried out between 1927 and 1932, and these were termed as the series of experiments which he did, which is called the Halcon Experiments. And he mixed a few set of workers within the manufacturing lines, wherein he mixed them and asked them to work on different lines, put male and female workers together, brought them into different shifts, and obviously asked them to work under different conditions, light conditions, for example. And he generally felt that if the conditions were good and there was teamwork within the workers and there was good communication with the managers, then the workers were highly effective or productive. If the communication was poor, lighting environment, or environment in which the workers were working and the conditions were not good, the overall work suffered, and obviously productivity was less. So his focus in the studies that he did was more based on what is called the human relations approach. And he proposed the idea that if people have to work within the organization and they have to be productive, they have to be working in teams, and these teams need to have good relationships amongst each other as colleagues, but at the same time, the managers need to have a very good working relationship to be able to influence and get the work done from their workers. Then we look at Maslow's theory of hierarchy. Now, he proposed when he did his modeling, and he proposed this theory of needs in the early 1940s. He devised what is called the Maslow's theory of motivation, and he basically talked about a pyramid. He said that in general, humans or people have 5 types of needs, and depending on the need that they have at any given point in time, that would determine the level of motivation the person or individual will have towards the organization. He classed them into 5 different types of needs, things like self-actualization, esteem, social, security, and psychological. And this was then plotted onto a pyramid. So when we talk about, let me show Maslow's pyramid. So when we talk about the Maslow's pyramid, what he basically did was, if I just very briefly put these across onto this slide just to make them more relevant. So when we talk about this particular pyramid, now he grouped these needs into 5 types. So he basically said at the bottom of the pyramid were psychological needs, which are basic needs of food, water, living, shelter. And those needs need to be, in some cases when people decide to work, they are basically working towards meeting those psychological needs. Above those needs come the safety needs, which are basically sense of security. That means your job is permanent, you have a permanent employment, you are safe, or you have safe working environment in terms where you work. And in terms, those were termed as safety needs. That means if you are to lose your job, there's a certain amount of notice period, and that provided a bit of a safety net for individuals when they were working within the organizations. Beyond the basic needs were psychological needs, and these needs were needs which basically he classified them as what are called belonging needs or esteem needs. So belonging needs were the needs wherein you would normally see that the individual wants to be a part of a team, wants to be a part wherein he's recognized by say for example by his teammates or essentially within the department. And his idea was that when we talk about some of these needs in terms of psychological needs, you want to be a part of a successful organization. You want to be a part of a winning team. You want to be a part and parcel of a new project which the company is embarking on. And they were essentially termed as what are called, psychological needs. So here, the idea was primarily looking at building relationship within the organization, having a sense of commitment, having a social grouping. Maybe when we had people, in his, studies, when he looked at people with psychological needs, had families, they were married, and obviously they had kids. So their a main aim was to try and avoid problems such as loneliness, depression, anxiety, and that is where the psychological needs, step in. And then the last classification, or the top of the pyramid, tended to be what is called the self-fulfillment needs, essentially. And in this case, basically self-actualization. That means at the peak, he feels that people who are at the peak of their career, or people who are at the top of the organization, there they want to basically look at making full use of their talent, their skills. They want to look at, exploiting their capabilities, and want to, look at an option wherein they are trying to fulfill a greater goal. So they are looking at, in the sense, getting recognition, but at the same time, they are looking at, fulfilling their desire to be able to achieve something which is considered, considered as a very developed need, or something which very few people are capable of actually achieving. And this is possible only because if you have number of years of experience, and you have been in those particular situations wherein you feel now that I have the experience and the stature and the relevance to be able to, achieve those needs. Now, his model initially, when he came across, he defined these as motivators. So he came up with these 5 motivators, which are clubbed into 3 different types of needs: basic, psychological, and self-actualization or fulfillment needs. And the idea here was that he proposed that when we look at getting workers to do their work, basically what they would do is they would look at, falling back onto the type of needs that they have, and basis the type of need the person has, that would be that would provide the level of motivation the worker would work with given within the organization, a task or a role or a function that the worker is asked to do. And this model, had some initial, let's say, issues, and there were concerns which were raised, but more or less, it moved us away from looking at just understanding that motivation is only related to networking or relationship, or motivation is just related to people being treated as economic resources, and wherein money tends to be the single, let's say, goal for individuals to be able to work together, accomplish, come together to accomplish certain things or targets together. Then we talk about, two-factor theory, which was the Iceberg theory. So he came up with 2 different types of factors. He was heavily influenced by Maslow. He did a lot of studies, with workers, especially, in McKinsey, when he, or within 1 or 2 organizations, wherein he basically studied accountants and engineers, and he studied their needs in terms of what keeps them motivated to work within the organization or to achieve the objectives. And he came up with these 5 different factors. Essentially, they are grouped into 2, but initially he came out with these factors, which are called the Iceberg Factors or Hygiene Factors. And here, the idea was that he basically said that, there are reasons of why people would be, more aligned to achieve or to complete a particular set of work. And these factors, which identify them with the individuals, were termed as what are called hygiene factors. So it could be motivators and hygiene factors. Also, when we talk about motivators, they could be factors like achievement, recognition, nature of job, responsibility, and personal growth. And they were like at the personal level. So motivators were termed as factors which are at the individual level, or the individuals are able to recognize it because that is directly related to them. And then the other factors were called the hygiene factors, which is where these factors are related to the organization or the company, where they are working, and they included things like company level of supervision, what kind of salary they get, and what are the working conditions they get within the organization. Now, this particular theory was adopted, in some of the Japanese companies, wherein they put a lot of focus on understanding what are the personal needs and what are the hygiene needs, and there has to be a match between them, or a balance between them, to be able to motivate the workers to achieve or complete these tasks which have been set. And essentially, this particular theory became quite popular because it allowed it basically boosted productivity within organizations, because there was a collaborative effort at the management level to understand the personal needs of the individual, which were motivators, and then also the hygiene factors, which were predominantly the reasons why the company was actually getting into the business, or providing those goods and services. And in those cases, you would generally see that this particular bit tend to work quite well within production, engineering, manufacturing, wherein the output is important at the end of the shift, or at the end of the day, depending on the number of shifts being run, and the output is clearly defined that, okay, if this shift is to run for 8 hours, this is the output that is required to be achieved. And in those cases, managers have to ensure that they have the motivators and also the hygiene factors working together in tandem, which allows them to make sure that the work at the end of the day gets achieved. We then talk about one or two last theories. One is Mcgregor's theory. He came up with two factors. Again, he's influenced by Herzberg's theory. He came up when he did his own research, and his views were that there are two types of factors which individuals normally look at. One is, and he classified them as into theory X and theory Y. Factors which theory X he proposed was that generally workers are not interested in working, they're unambitious, they're lazy, they are essentially untrustworthy and irresponsible, and if the management does not come heavy-handed and they are not controlled or monitored, then the work would not get achieved. And then theory Y basically is exact opposite, which believes that managers enjoy work, and obviously money is not the only factor, which what the workers look at for working, and in this case he said that the workers could be motivated and could be made much more responsible to organize and get things done if they were more satisfied with the management and the general working conditions, or if the needs of the workers were met, then they will be more towards working in favor of the organization. Now, when we talk about Mcgregor's theory, we also look at that his theory X, which are the two bits that he proposed. So the X side of the theory, the left view of the theory, actually corresponds to scientific management, work, or the theory or the experiments which Frederick Taylor did. And when we talk about the theory Y, this tends to lean more towards what are called the Herzberg factors or Maslow's factors, because he talks about 3 instead of 5 factors, which are things like non-financial reward, recognition, empowerment while making decisions, and these were all classed as what are called theory Y. Now, when we talk about one of the last theories, which is the McLeighlin's theories, here, his work, is heavily influenced by Maslow. What he did was he did a bit of a grouping that there are 3 different types of needs which individual have, and these 3 different types of needs could be need for affiliation, power, and achievement. And depending on the type of need the individual has, he proposes that you will need to put those related parameters or variables into play in order to ensure that the individual is able to do the work, or in this case is able to achieve the tasks which have been set. One of his basic presumptions was that the person's needs are heavily influenced by the cultural background they come from and the experiences that they've had in their previous working environment. And what he did was he further, elaborated on what is need for affiliation. Need for affiliation basically meant that people wanted or had a desire to be liked and accepted by others within the organization. So they wanted a cooperative or a collaborative working environment, which meant that there would be instances where the workers would be allowed to influence and get or basically feel liked by other workers within the organization, and that allowed them to be more productive. Then there are workers which are basically influenced by need for power. That means they want to basically make sure that they are leading from the start. They could be having the decision-making power. They would be the ones which would normally be required to make decisions when it comes to, taking important decisions on certain aspects within the organization, have a definitive stay within the organization. So there, the need for power meant that in these cases, the people felt that we need to be having the responsibility and the ability to be able to make decisions when it is required, and then have the authority to be able to delegate work and manage teams. And that is where the need for power comes in. That you want to be superior, you want to be, because of your experience and the background that you have in that organization, or with the number of years of experience and different roles that you played within the organization, you're empowered essentially, and that empowerment allows you to have or yield power. And that power could be in the sense that you have more responsibility, you have a title. It could be power in terms of decision making, or in terms of leading a number of individuals as or supervising them, and that would be need for power. The last one that you basically proposed was the third type, which is need for achievement. So here, individuals are motivated by the fact that they want to achieve, they want to excel, they want to exceed, they want to make sure that the targets are done, they want to be recognized, they want a challenging environment. And in this case, their main aim or motivation comes from the fact that they are feeling proud, or they are feeling excited because they are able to meet the challenges which have been set. And they in general tend to be craving for praise, recognition and they would want rewards for what they have achieved when doing a particular task or a job within the organization. Now, one of the last theories which I would want to focus on would be the Vroom's theory. Now, the important theories that we will come across at some stage in our lifetime, and obviously that is why it is important to know at least names and what they basically propose. Now, Vroom's theory is also called the expectancy theory. Here, why is it called the expectancy theory? Is because the motivation to complete a task is actually influenced by their personal views. They want to calculate whether this task is going to be doable or not doable, whether this task could lead to a consequential outcome, the desired outcome which the organization wants to look at. And the last but not the least, what they also want to do is they want to understand whether this is important, or is it that important for the organization and for them to be able to achieve this particular task, if it is going to be something of a decision where let's say whether this is going to be a life and death decision. So before they accept any responsibility, before they accept any let's say the job itself, they would want to make sure that the job is doable. They want to make sure that the job, when achieved, is going to fulfill the aim or objective of why this has been done. And last but not the least, what is the probability that even if I give my best, or my teammates and me give my best to do the job, we will still not end up completing it, or we'll still not end up achieving it. So they would then decide that if the probability of achieving or completing it is less, they would give up the job altogether. So the expectation side of things actually drives how individuals will be motivated within the organization, and that was core and central to the work which Vroom did in terms of proposing his theory. So here, whether the individual will achieve a job, whether they believe that the job can be completed, and in some cases, what is the probability that they would be able to complete the job, even if they have the skill set, the required infrastructure or required requisites available to be able to complete, but they will work out a probability first to see whether, oh no, this is something that I need to do. No, I don't think this is something I need to do, even if I try my level best. and three of us work together, we still will not be able to achieve it. So there's no point in going after it. And that is what they would mean that when I say they would also assess whether the probability of doing the job would be there or not. Now, with this basic bit of understanding and the theories that we look at, we would get into some of the assessment criteria. Now, one of the things why we look at, motivation is quite clear is that managers, leaders would need tools and techniques and would want to understand how and what motivates or what makes the individual tick within the organization for them to be able to stretch and achieve certain objectives, and that would be all termed as motivation. Now, the first assessment criteria basically focuses on, looking at analyzing the benefits and issues which the organization gets if they involve employees in the decision-making process. Now, before I get into that, any questions on the theories?
Not from my side. Thank you.
And no questions.
Okay. So there's a bit of a handout which is going to be available, and what I've covered these theories on is in a couple of slides, but this handout is about 10 to 12 pages long, and it gives the entire detail of how these theories originated, what the experiments were, and essentially would be covering those concepts in a bit more detail. So the crux is we need to understand why these were proposed, how they were different in their thinking, and why they have stuck on, and which are in today's modern context. So we look at Frederick Taylor, starting point of the topic of motivation, and we then at some of the Likard and the Philip Kotler's proposed model, which are variations or modifications to Maslow's theory, Mcgregor's theory, or McClelland's theory in terms of how they are applied and when they are applied in the modern context within organizations. Now, when we look at the first assessment criteria, which is basically talking about analyzing the benefits of benefits and issues of involving employees in the decision-making process, one of the key things which pops out is, why do you think organizations involve employees in the decision-making process? So it is a no-brainer that why do they involve employees in the decision-making processes? Because at the end of the day, there are a couple of things that I can think of even before, looking into some of the points on the slide, is that one of the things that we realize, there are lots of different types of resources which are, used within an organization or a business. You have physical, administrative, infrastructural, financial, human resources. Now, one of the key reasons why decision-making process tends to be, involving employees is that employees or human resources are one such resource which is able to control, manage, monitor, and work on all the other resources. So if you have good employees within the organization which have skills, they are motivated, they are having a background and experience of have worked within prior similar roles, then you would generally see that the organization would be prospering, because they have focused on ensuring that the employees they recruit have the requisite skill set to be able to perform those responsibilities on a day in, day out basis. The second point I would look at is that when we look at involving employees in the decision-making process, it brings ownership. So if you discuss that this is the task, this is the objective of the task, this is the reason why we need to do this, these are the benefits of it, you would generally see ownership from employees coming across. And when you have ownership from employees towards working, towards achieving and completing those tasks, you would generally see that this brings more effectiveness within the organization. Empowering the individuals to be able to make decisions, again, would also be supportive of the fact that this would be one of the benefits, is because, one, it will allow individuals to learn from mistakes if things are not going as they would have planned, or in some cases, when people are put together into teams, you would generally that they would be able to come up with the a plausible or a workable solution much more quickly than if they are left alone and working in silos. So when we talk about involving employees in terms of getting the benefits, they tend to be a number of benefits, and it could be things like empowerment, recognition. It could be things which are related to ownership, bringing more loyalty in terms of their work, dedication. And in some cases, you would also see that in some organizations, involving them in the decision-making process also helps the organization detect errors or detect quality-related problems, because sometimes you would see within organizations there are parallel teams which are put together on projects. They work against each other on timelines to be able to achieve those objectives. And because they're working in opposite teams, you would also see that this sometimes helps to improve quality, because teams would take different approaches to come to the output or to reach a solution. And in those cases when the output, the routine or the route that they take to come to the output also allows the organization to diagnose prospective problems or issues which could be uncovered in the case of quality. For example, when we look at physical products or goods and services being manufactured within the organization. And if I relate this to what we have studied in Learning Outcome 1, management styles, in Learning Outcome 2 to culture and structure, and in Learning Outcome 3, when we basically relate it to measurement of productivity, learning within the organization, and also to the aspect of change, you would generally see that if I throw that in, it will immediately come to you that sometimes change has to be brought across. Employees have to be empowered or involved in the decision-making process, because they're able to embrace the whole process of change much more quickly, because they feel that they are empowered and they understand the reasons why this change is being done within the organization. Now here, when we look at analysis and when we talk about the benefits and issues which are involved, we would look at, maybe taking an example of, say, one type of organization or type of, culture within the organization, and that will help us understand how we see involving employees in the decision-making process benefits the organization. So if I go back and, maybe, I don't know, when we look at strategic management, there is a topic which we will look at in personal leadership and strategic development would be, or leadership or strategic development would be, that there are three types of decision making that happens within the organization, or there are three types of management, structures within the organization. You normally see the corporate tier, you see the functional tier, or the strategic decision making tier in the middle, and then you see the operational or the functional tier, which is actually carrying out the day-to-day responsibilities. Now, if I relate this to the triangle wherein we talk about three types of decision making happening within the organization, you look at the board or the top management makes strategic decisions. The managers in the middle, which are termed as middle management, would be responsible for making or taking tactical decisions. And then when you look at people at the bottom of the pyramid, people who are working on the factory floor or are facing or are customer facing, would be looking at taking operational decisions which are going to be done on a day-to-day basis. So when we look at the importance of, let's say, involving employees in decision making, and when we look at the levels of decisions which have to be done within the organization, it makes it apparently clear that why this is a win-win formula, or why does it benefit the organization. So when you look at strategic decisions and when you look at tactical and operational decisions, what you would generally see is that they would also, be corresponding to, different people within the organization. So when I say operational decisions, these are people who are basically, as I mentioned before, working on the, front end, or providing on, dealing with customers on a daily basis. And here they have to be empowered to make those decisions. A simple example in this case would be when we talk about customer service and people who are working within the customer services team or are dealing with customers directly. If they are faced with a particular problem, and if the customer reports a problem on a particular product or service, then it has to be clearly defined by the operational team in the working manual that if this problem occurs, this is the solution that you can provide to the customer. If this kind of a situation comes, then you would be required to deal with this situation in this way. Now, if this is missing, then in some stage, if none of the options above are meeting the criteria, you would generally see that managers would empower the team leaders, in this case, would empower the front-end people who are on the phone or dealing with customers to be able to make a decision to say, okay, we will refund this, or we will apologies for the problem that you faced. In order to compensate you for this, we will offer you a £10 gift voucher, or, extend your period of service by 3 months. And these are discretionary things which are allowed by the managers to the front-end staff, making operational decisions on a daily basis to be able to solve and close the problems. And that is where decision making, is important. And that is the benefit is it saves time, it addresses the problem, it brings ownership, and last but not the least, the involvement of the employee in being a part of a greater good to help solve that problem and progress in that particular area would be the benefit that you would generally see the organization would get. Now, sometimes you would see when we look at tallying this with the level of decision, so we know there are decisions at the corporate level, tactical level, or say strategic level, tactical level, and operational level. But when we talk about group decision making, I can also classify them into what is called individual decision making and group decision making. Now, when we look at, there are pros and cons for these individual and group decision making, and in some situations you would see that these would also be applicable. Now, if you are working in a call center and you're faced with problems, you would have some sort of solutions which would have already been predefined, and in this case, the decision of communicating that to the customer when you're handling the call will typically happen at the individual level. And what will happen is you'll have to be prompt at understanding the procedure, understanding the problem, whether it's company problem, whether it's a product problem, whether it's a problem which is specific to the customer or something else. You will delineate that problem, and the decision making will essentially happen at the individual level. So here, typically decision making process would be faster, quicker, and in some cases, if there are decisions which are taken at the end of the day when the manager reviews that, okay, you've given out so many goodies, or you've given out this, yes, you've closed so many calls, but you've also costed this much amount of money in order to close those calls, and that would be bringing an accountability towards the individual decision making side. Now, there are going to be situations within organizations wherein decision making is not the only criteria, and they would not be reliant on the fact that they need to be made quickly because it involves costs. In some cases, it is related to quality, and in some cases, it is also related to maybe replacing the product or, looking into understanding what are the fundamental reasons why this failure or why this problem has occurred. And in those cases, you would see group decision making happening. Imagine a situation wherein you bought a washing machine or a dishwasher, or you've just got your car serviced. And in this case, if we look at the background, there will be a number of people which will be involved in servicing your car. So normally you would have gone into the dealership, met the front-end person or somebody in customer service. They would have booked your car in for service. But in the background, a number of engineers or car mechanics would have worked on it. And if you take the delivery after the service has been done and still find a problem, then you go back, and at that stage, the decision making which will be required to be done would be group decision making, because when you narrate or provide the problem, the front end desk would go back to the back end, speak to the service engineer or the team leader who was responsible for servicing, and his team which was responsible in servicing that car, and they will reconstruct some of the bits which went on and see where the problem occurred. So in those cases, you would see that sometimes here group decision making would be required in order to provide a solution to the customer. Now, there are pros and cons of it, but obviously what it allows to do in the organizational context is that it helps solve problem, it builds ownership, it creates engagement, it empowers the employees essentially to be accountable while making those decisions, and it put forwards what is called a model which is related to the management style, if I go back and relate it, which is the participative style of management. And in this case, the participative style of management, any idea in terms of what was participative style of management or leadership? So in which what we see is that all members of the organization work together to make decisions. So decisions here are made in groups wherein the manager, the workers, maybe the senior management would be involved. And in those cases, you would generally see that the decision-making process tends to be slightly more cumbersome, lengthier, or slow. But it then requires group decision-making because the problems at hand are bigger than the problems that you normally would see when individual decision-making is required. Okay. So this particular task would require you to analyze the issues and benefits of involving employees in the decision-making process. And to a certain extent, what I've done is I've highlighted the issues and benefits by summarizing them in this particular table. Because it requires analysis, you would need to take up a practical or a living example in terms of an issue that has been faced and how that has been resolved, and where all would you see the issue, the issue being resolved, but where all you would see benefits of that coming when we see the employee engagement and involvement in that in the decision-making process. Now, whether that is at the strategic, operational, or strategic, tactical, and operational level, using that side of the example, or in this case, look at group/individual decision-making by classifying your example, and that would end up helping you to do analysis and accomplishing this particular task. Is that okay? Now,
yeah, perfect.
Okay, let's go to the second one, which is explain different ways to motivate employees. Now, there is a lot of literature which is available, and I think when we look at our day-to-day lives and obviously are working within organizations or businesses, companies where we work, you would normally see there are different ways through which motivation is created, or motivation plays a very important part, and we see that being enacted out almost on a daily, weekly, monthly, fortnightly, quarterly basis. Now, the reason why we want to motivate employees is quite clear, that when objectives are set, which are annual objectives, quarterly, 6-monthly objectives, when they are set, the management wants to get a buy-in of these objectives, that they are achievable, they are manageable, and what they want is a buy-in from the employees to be able to achieve these objectives at the end of the day. Example, sales target are given. Example, marketing targets are given that, okay, this year we're going to grab 0.2% market share from a competitor. We're going to be launching a new product in the next 18 months. And here would be to ensure that the product launch is successful. So there are targets indirectly or directly involved in all the activities which are carried out, within organization and businesses. Now, in order to ensure the management, what it does is, in order to ensure that these, targets are met, these timelines are met, you're hitting these milestones while you're working within the organization, the management would not want to, let's put it this way, the management would want to ensure that all these are being met, and they would want to put some, incentives, or put some, perks, incentives in place, which would keep you motivated when we consider the type of need that you are motivated with, whether it's psychological need, self-actualization need, basic need. And at every level, the HR managers would be working to ensure that there are commensurate incentive schemes, commensurate reward schemes. There are, places where recognition, achievement of the target and goal and objective can be recognized. And in some cases, they would also have, say, the Employee of the Year award or the Employee of the Month award and things like that. And those are all going to be areas through which the management would be looking at creating that buzz or that atmosphere which will allow the workers to strive to be able to achieve those objectives. And that is where we would see that they would want that agreement to happen. So the agreement in terms of agreeing to the numbers, agreeing to the targets which they're going to take, what are the demands in order to achieve those targets, which could be, okay, this year if the target is so and so, like if I say that, okay, after post-COVID, most companies would be aggressively marketing and coming out with programs, schemes, promotions, and the idea would be they would want to regain, the lost business that they have had in the last 15, 16 months. So everybody is going to be aggressive in the market. Now, in order to ensure that these, aggressive targets are met, what managers would ensure is that there are incentive reward achievement schemes which are put in place, which allows each and every individual to be able to stretch and achieve those objectives. And that is where the sense of recognition, for example, the sense of achievement would be instilled, and that is where the whole use of motivational techniques or motivational models would come in. Now, it is a no-brainer that what we normally see is that motivation in terms of money, rewards, let's say power or a promotion or a title, and in some cases more delegation of responsibility, and in senior management cases, promotions and employee stock option plans, depending on the level and number of years of experience, roles and responsibilities, and the hierarchy in which you work, and the type of decisions you make, the motivational techniques used by organizations would be commensurate to where in which level of the organization you're working. So if you're at the operational level, there'll be schemes and incentives. If you're at the tactical or in the middle management level, there'll be long-term rewards or objectives which will be there to be able to motivate you. Things like promotion, additional responsibility, maybe taking care of a strategic business unit, transfer to another branch as a branch manager, in some cases foreign assignments or deputations, because you have a number of years of experience and the company is looking at opening projects or opening locations in other countries. So you would be deputized to go because you have that experience, and that would include travel, seniority, title. But at the management level where strategic decisions are done, they are going to be more qualitative, and they are going to be related to things like grabbing more market share, profitability, revenue, bottom line related aspects, and their rewards are going to be things like employee stock option plans, a percentage over and above the bonus or the increase in salaries that they get, and obviously increased responsibilities that they would have. And that would be all, factors of motivation which companies would, draft towards ensuring that the objectives are achieved within the organization. Now, one of the things that we normally see, in terms of organization is that organization tries to always reward, let's say, employees by using something called intrinsic rewards. So when we talk about intrinsic rewards or intrinsic motivation, this is an act of doing something which allows you to be, let's say, it allows you to do something which primarily would be without the external rewards that you would want to get. So in some cases, what you will generally see is that employees would basically just generally enjoy the work. They find it interesting, but they would rather be outside the pressure of incentives or rewards to be able to complete or achieve that work or meet that timeline. So essentially what it means is that the employees really do not care about any additional, let's say, things which are provided if you accomplish this task. So what they would want to do is do it in a normal way or in a way wherein they feel that, this is going to be something that we need to achieve, but they are not motivated by essentially getting some external rewards for completion of that task. And extrinsic rewards tend to be, or motivation tends to be, a reward-driven behavior, or we also call this as a carrot and stick approach in some cases. And in some cases, you see that sometimes in certain sectors, you have targets, you have stretch targets, and you have super stretch targets. But when you achieve those, you're getting multipliers or, additional bonus or incentives, because in this case, you're driven primarily by reward-driven behavior. And that is where it tends to be extrinsic rewards or extrinsic side of motivation. Now, there's a very good article which is available for you to additionally read, and this talks about, top 5 methods which organizations employ essentially in keeping their employees motivated. Now, in this particular task, because it talks about explain, so what you have to do is explain a few ways through which, organizations would essentially look at motivating their employees. So you could take up examples like reward, incentive schemes, perks. When I talk about perks, it could be things like private dental insurance. It could include perks, which would mean that the employee would get a mobile phone or a laptop, which could be for the office, but also get a car at a certain stage in their employment. and that would be, or you would get perks like the company subsidizes or reimburses the cost of, the rental for your house income and some of the other expenses. And those are examples that you would be able to take to explain, why or explain how organizations use different ways to motivate their employees. Now, when we go across to the, merit criteria, it talks about analyzing how motivational theories can inform employee motivation. Now, from the 6 or 7 different types of motivational theories that we have covered in the beginning of this particular discussion, the idea would be to try and pick any 2 and then elaborate them by using an example that where you have seen them being applied or in what appropriate, situations you would see these theories actually working. So when we talk about them in general, what we will need to do is basically look at talking about, how these theories can be applied when you need to use them in order to really get the work done within the organization. Now, before you get into this, we also would need to explain very briefly what is the cycle of motivation. So cycle of motivation essentially looks at needs actually create or define the individual behavior. The behavior of the individual is then read by the organization, wherein we understand either the needs are physical, psychological, where the way you behave, whether it's going to be esteem needs, power needs, and that by the study of understanding what your attitude and behavior is within the organization, the HR or the manager would be able to determine the adequate level of awards or reward essentially which can be put in order to get that requisite behavior in terms of the individual showing that requisite behavior, and for that they would put some sort of a commensurate reward. Now, if you're hitting that expectation, you're getting that performance reward, then in turn it completes the cycle that it creates a bit of satisfaction, loyalty, and motivation towards working in that role within the organization. So when we talk about the cycle of motivation tends to be looking at identifying what the employee needs, what are the basic driving factors for the behavior that the individual shows, and then basically netting out rewards which are commensurate to that behavior or the attitude shown by the individual, so that it is having a positive effect in terms of the individual being able to achieve those aims and objectives. A simple example that I would give here in this case would be, if you look at most customer services teams. Now, the clear, mandate in most organizations tend to be that we want to keep the customer complaints at a very, at a certain level. And if the complaints do occur, then we want these complaints to be handled very effectively so that most of them are resolved the same day. And if there has to be a replacement, repair, or other kind of things to be required to be met in terms of criteria, then they should also be brought to a closure within N+3 days. So it should not take more than 3 days to be able to resolve a particular complaint. And in some cases, you would see that when companies are good at providing an excellent customer service, what they tend to do in some cases is they will look at replacement rather than repairs. They will look at, statutory, let's say, acting on some of the statutory guidelines which allow products to be returned within a certain day, no questions asked. And all these things look at essentially ensuring that, what they do is they solve the problems as quickly as possible. And in those cases, what you would see is that managers, when they review or set these tasks, they follow this particular cycle of motivation, is because what they understand is there is a need, and that need leads to or shows or makes the individual behave in a certain way. When they behave in a certain way, what they tend to do is, they want to have a positive, they want to be able to catch that positive side of that effect when they behave in a certain way, and that is where they would want to reward the individual to show that positive behavior within the organization. And that, if it is done consistently, leads to what is called greater job satisfaction, and that means the employees would stick within the organization and obviously continue in that particular role or responsibility which has been given. Now, we also see that sometimes when employees, and we talk about motivation, we will also see that in some cases, simple division of work, when we look at breaking the work down and relating it to, going back to another theory that we talked about, the extrinsic, and we talked about, hygiene factors. So there were motivators and hygiene factors. So when we relate that to the two different types of motivation which individuals would show within the organization, extrinsic and intrinsic. Intrinsic tends to be the ones which are related to salary and benefits, and they are more meeting towards what are called meeting the basic level of needs, which are going to be psychological or hygiene factors. And when we talk about intrinsic, they tend to be more of when we talked about the factors which are related to the company, things like recognition, title, achievement, challenge they are offered in the job, and obviously appreciation that they get. And they tend to be controlled more by, rewards at the qualitative level. So you would normally see intrinsic motivation factors tending to be that if they want to keep the employees within the organization, you would normally see long-term plans for rewards being put into place. Things like a certain amount of incremental increase in the salary every year on performance appraisal, maybe applicability of certain additional perks, which would mean that if you have 5 years of working within the organization at that level, you'll be entitled for say medical insurance or private annual dental insurance. At 10 years of work experience within the organization, you might be entitled for a certain amount of additional benefits, which could include, for example, company subsidizing the cost of your children's schooling, maybe subsidizing the cost of your let's say house or rental income, rents that you are paying. And in some cases you would see that in that structure, you would normally see that the employees would be given benefits which would be locked with a particular time period, and that would allow the employees to stay within the organization for a few more years before they divest. So in those cases, you look at stock options, you look at long-term bonuses in terms of how the company would perform, or the share price would go up and down, and they would be related to company-related factors, and they would be termed as intrinsic motivation. So here, when we talk about intrinsic motivation, what we basically see is that here the individuals are generally interested in doing their job and doing it well, rather than any incentive or rewards that they might be getting. So here the company, in order to motivate them, needs to put long-term rewards into place, which will reward the right behaviors over a period of time, the right kind of, the accomplishments and achievements they do over a period of time. And that tends to be generally through, what I've seen practically in places of my work is they normally would give you an employee stock option plan, say they'll give you 10,000 shares, which can be divested over a period of 5 years, with certain number going in the first year, certain in the second year. And that tends to be a greater benefit than increments in salary or per incentives. And that is what is required in the case of, intrinsic motivational factors. So here, the idea would be to look at taking up an example. And these would be, you could look at Maslow's theory here. You could look at the hygiene factors, the Iceberg theory. You could look at Mcgregor's theory, and here think of ingenious ways through which you can you can actually relate that to a particular situation or an organization, which basically will go to show how you are able to implement and analyze some of the motivational theories by use of examples. The simplest way to do this would be using Maslow's theory, because we clearly know that in the Maslow's theory there are 5 types of needs, and you can individualize those 5 types of needs and relate that to an example by saying, okay, if there are basic needs, psychological needs, and self-actualization needs, 3 different types. Within that, if you look at various types of needs, this is what would be motivating the individuals to essentially, work on that role, achieve that task, or achieve that goal or objective. So a couple of slides which are put to explain, and then that is what you could also pick up in terms of looking at doing your analysis with at least 2 theories being applied and then an example being taken to show the analysis. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? We quickly go across to the distinction criteria. In the distinction criteria, we need to look at a named organization, as I mentioned. So in my example, I've taken up the organization Tesco in the UK, and used that as a bit of a background to explain why and how the organization motivates its employees. It has got some 500,000 employees working across 14 different countries in about 6,000 different stores. And it is a challenging task for the management here to keep their employees motivated. So we have talked about a few motivational things, in terms of how motivation is, considered and how it is rolled out across the organization at different levels. And I've quoted one or two, theories essentially to look at, saying at the staff which is working on contract basis, on a minimum wage basis, they would be primarily looking at, basic needs, and then the needs would be essentially looking at getting a structured way, number of hours to be able to work through in a week and a month, and then obviously looking at, some sort of longevity in the job. You talk about middle managers, there's obviously the motivation is going to be related to more towards the measurement of the output in terms of the work that they are doing, and that would be related to it, perks, incentives, and certain other emoluments which they would get if they are able to meet those objectives at the end of the year. And the top management was essentially be incentivized on long-term objectives or achieving the vision of the organization, which is 3-year, 5-year plans in terms of market share, in terms of profitability, and they would have different types of techniques which is going to be applied. And in most cases, it tends to be stock option plan, bonuses, and they tend to be slightly disproportionate because of the fact that the rewards are greater than what they would normally enjoy when we see salary increases or performance appraisal happening on a yearly basis. And then generally good communication and building a good relationship, looking at essentially ensuring that there is a good communication between the management and employees. The front-end employees of the organization have access to the management, and openness and communication within the organization also keeps the morale high and keeps the employee motivated. So here, the idea would be to pick up a particular organization that you are aware of, and then talk about what kind of motivational techniques or tools the organization uses in order to ensure that they keep these things working. And when I say these things working, I mean the employees working and achieving within the organization. And this would mean that you might have access to the employee handbook, which would give out certain details about in some cases these schemes, incentives, and other bits are drawn up on a yearly basis. But for senior management, you would normally see them in the annual journal report, wherein for example, for large organizations, you would generally see that the management would get so many stock options, so much money would be given out as bonuses, or if the share price of the Tesla rises, for example, Elon Musk, has set up an example to the board that he would normally draw only $1 pay, a $1 a month pay if the market capitalization of the company falls below a certain level. But if it goes beyond a certain level, then he rakes in about $1 billion in terms of incentive and bonuses, which is where he sees that his work is to drive, and his motivation tends to be at that level wherein it is not just money, it is power, but it is also taking exponential risks to be able to the management of the company allowing the individual to be able to take exponential risks to make gains for the organization. And in some cases, it plays off towards the individual, where the organizations gain and the individuals also gain massively because the rewards are disproportionate. And in some cases, you would see that you would normally see departures because in some cases these objectives are not fulfilled or they are too aggressive, and that is where the company looks at balancing it out. The board of the company looks at balancing it out to ensure that the motivation is commensurate, or the output that the employee creates is commensurate, and they get the desired rewards, which would be commensurate to their achieving and continuing to work for the organization. So any questions on today's session?
This is everything. No.
Okay, good stuff. So what I'm going to do is, let me just have a quick look at Moodle, and I'm going to try and draw your attention towards some of the handouts which have been kept.